vengono divisi, uno in una stanza, l'altro in un'altra, nessuno sa cosa dice l'altro e cadono in una serie di piccole contraddizioni. La loro preoccupazione è di essere stati presi perché appunto anarchici e hanno paura di dirlo e cadono in contraddizioni. Queste loro contraddizioni è l'inizio del loro calvario.
There was no tangible evidence linking Vanzetti to the South Braintree robbery and murder. In the absence of any strong case against him, the best way they could get a conviction was to try him first in connection with his botched robbery in Bridgewater.
The Bridgewater crime had occurred on December 24th, 1919. It was another attempted payroll robbery in which several armed men tried to stop a payroll truck in the street. One of them fired a couple of shotgun shells. Basically, the truck simply managed to drive away and the men fled.
There's very little evidence in this trial against Vanzetti. He has a very distinctive handlebar mustache, and it's very difficult to find witnesses who will testify that they saw him. And in fact, his defense attorney is able to put over a dozen witnesses on the stand testifying that they saw Vanzetti on the day of the robbery. On Christmas Eve, Italian families traditionally eat eels. Vanzetti's a fish seller. He spent all day on Christmas Eve selling eels to the Italian families in his neighborhood. So something like 13 or 14 different people testified that they either bought eels from Vanzetti that day, or in the case of Beltrando Brini, testified that he sold eels with Vanzetti all day that day. All of the witnesses who are testifying on Vanzetti's behalf speak Italian. They all need translators, and the prosecutor, Frederick Katzman, just dismantles them on the stand.
These eyewitnesses were simply ruled unreliable. And why? Because they were Italians. They were, how could you believe an Italian testifying about an Italian? You can only believe an Anglo-Saxon testifying about an Italian, especially when you're talking to an all-Anglo-Saxon jury and an Anglo-Saxon judge.
The presiding judge in the trial for the Bridgewater botched holdup was Judge Webster Thayer. Vanzetti, at one point, referred to Webster Thayer as a cobra in a black frock. That about sums it up. He detested foreigners, had an absolutely pathological hatred of radicals, and perceived himself as a kind of St. George who was going to battle the Red Dragon. There was no possibility of this man conducting himself in an impartial manner.
And he convicted or sentenced Vanzetti just for the attempted robbery. And the sentence was something along the lines of 15 years, which was just an unheard of sentence for someone who'd never been arrested, much less convicted of a crime.
The Bridgewater conviction certainly persuaded Katzman, I think, that he might get a murder conviction as well in the South Braintree trial. And now that Vanzetti was branded a guilty man, that was going to help too.
Judge Webster Thayer, having presided over Vanzetti's case, he specifically requests that he be entrusted with the South Braintree case. In their communication, the head of the Massachusetts Supreme Court tells Thayer, I am assigning you to hear the most important murder case since the last century, if not all time.
And it's after this first conviction of Vanzetti that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the New York radical, comes to Boston. And Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was the lover of, and the political associate of Carlo Tresca. And Tresca suggests that she stop in and see two comrades in prison. So Flynn hears about the verdict against Vanzetti, and Tresca and Flynn recommend new counsel for Boston. And that's when Fred Moore comes on the case. And it is then that things really begin to churn.
Fred Moore, he was from the West Coast. He was a man whom left-wing labor people would turn to when they were in trouble. And on that basis, he was recruited to take over the defense of this case. It probably turned out to be a sad day for the defendants, although Moore undoubtedly did conduct a very vigorous defense.
His tactic was to politicize the case. He assumed automatically there is no way that Sacco and Vanzetti can get a fair trial in a capitalist court. Consequently, you put capitalism and its court system on trial instead. It made Judge Thayer absolutely rabid. So Thayer developed this antipathy for Moore even before the trial began. And they see Moore as largely responsible for bringing all of this attention and embarrassment to Massachusetts, to its judicial system. And the more the case became as cause célèbre, the more solidified the determination to see these men die in the electric chair.
Fred Moore is, I don't think he's completely pessimistic, but I think he understands the seriousness of what he's up against. And early on in his correspondence, he observes that an Italian accused of murder in Massachusetts stands about as much chance of getting a fair trial as a black man accused of rape in the South.
The trial in Dedham for the South Braintree crime begins on May 31st in 1921. It lasts for 7 weeks. It lasts through the dead of the summer, through the heat of the summer. And it's a spectacle in a lot of ways. There are police from not only Dedham, but 5 surrounding towns who are protecting the community against Sacco and Vanzetti. They're led in manacles into and out of the courtroom 4 times a day, surrounded by guards.
Oh, Lord, the trial was heavily covered. My word, you wouldn't want to be there. There were threats, bomb threats, all kinds of nonsense. It was sensational. I guess that's the only way to put it. The whole ambiance was just sensational. And Sacco and Vanzetti were in a cage, which in those days was used to hold the defendant. It looked like a cage, very much so.
The bulk of the trial was taken up with eyewitnesses. The direct and cross-examination of eyewitnesses on both sides who did or did not place Sacco and Vanzetti in this crime. In the case of Vanzetti, there was something drastically wrong with every single identification. The ID witness of Vanzetti closest to the crime scene, the gate tender who raised the gate for the bandit car to get out of South Braintree, claimed that he saw Vanzetti driving the car, where it is clear that Vanzetti never knew how to drive a car.
Mary Swain and Devlin, Francis Devlin, were 2 office workers. They were the ones that helped put up the payroll. They worked with Parmenter and Baradelli. The office was in the upper factory up here.
At the grand jury, both of them were very tentative, and Katzman basically spent 15 or 20 minutes badgering them until he got them to give a firm identification. Then at trial, both of them became very firm, despite the fact that their opportunity to observe the bandit, who they claimed was Sacco, leaning out of the car, was very fleeting from a second-story window as the car drove by. And yet, these were presented by Katzman in his summation as 2 of the strongest witnesses.
There was a man named Carlos Goodridge who testified against Sacco, saying he saw him drive by and point a gun at him. There were 4 different people who testified that Carlos Goodridge told them he ducked inside the pool hall where he was playing pool immediately when the shooting began and that he hadn't seen anything. And in fact, later on it was discovered that his name was actually Erastus Corning. He had a lengthy criminal record in New York. At one point, he had actually committed perjury so he could get a marriage license to commit bigamy. So he was an unreliable witness at best. Louis Pelzer worked in one of the factories nearby. He testified not only to Sacco's identity, but he also identified the license plate number of the getaway car. There were 2 or 3 witnesses who later testified that he ducked under a bench as soon as the firing started and that he told them he hadn't seen anything.
World War I is not long ended. All of the patriotic din of World War I, the flags waving and the trumpets blowing, still in the air. The bodies of soldiers are still coming home from France. The patriotic spirit, the jingoistic spirit, was there in the air, pervaded the courtroom.
The foreman of the jury, a man named Ripley, actually salutes the flag every morning when he comes in. Frederick Katzman, in a very famous exchange with Sacco, challenges him to defend whether he loves a free country or not, whether he loves the United States because it's a free country.
You love this country. But when she was about to call upon you to become a soldier, you ran away to Mexico?
Please let me say...
Answer yes or no. Did you go to Mexico to evade serving as a soldier of this country that you love?
So here we are in the case that is supposed to be about a murder, and Katzman is asking him not about that, but he's asking him about his resistance to the draft, his opposition to the war, his running away to Mexico to evade the draft. You would think that if this were a fair trial, the judge would rule out that as irrelevant. But of course, Judge Thayer is not going to rule anything out that has to do with the ideology of Sacco and Vanzetti, anything that will really turn the minds of the jury against these two men. So during the trial, Katzman is able to make it clear that Sacco and Vanzetti are anarchists. They are draft dodgers. They are opponents of the war. They are unpatriotic. And this becomes far more important than whether they committed this robbery and this murder.
The case that the prosecution sought to make against Vanzetti was the most flimsy of any kind of circumstantial evidence. No one identified him as being at the scene or firing at the scene. It was the fact that, so the prosecution alleged, that Baradelli probably had a .38 caliber Harrington & Richardson, and that Vanzetti was found 2 weeks later when he was arrested with a .38 caliber Harrington & Richardson. There are thousands and thousands of Harrington & Richardsons, a very common weapon. How are you going to connect one with the other? And the only proof they had of it was, well, Baradelli had a .38, you have a .38, same manufacturer, same gun. That's logic that not only limps, it falls on its face.
Researchers discovered in the late 1970s that the prosecution knew all along that Vanzetti's gun hadn't belonged to Baradelli, that the serial numbers didn't match. And that's just a stunning revelation. Not only does it indicate that the prosecution lied to convict Vanzetti, that the case against Vanzetti was basically non-existent, but it also leaves open enormous speculation about what they did to convict Sacco. If they lied to convict Vanzetti, of course, the implication is that they would be willing to lie to convict Sacco as well.
If you're the prosecutor, the district attorney, and you want to get Sacco into the crime, the easiest way to do it is to make sure that one of the bullets taken from one of these victims came from Sacco's pistol, and one of the shells came from it. You need that at a minimum, and that's exactly what was done.
They didn't have the foggiest notion back in 1920 how to definitively determine that a particular bullet or a particular cartridge case came from a gun to the exclusion of any other gun.
There were 6 bullets that struck the two men. 5 of the 6 bullets and 3 of the 4 shells came from a weapon that has never been recovered. Bullet 3 and shell W are the odd bullet and shell that were introduced at the trial. All these bullets have grooves in them that were left by the barrels of the gun through which they were fired. The other 5 bullets, the grooves slope noticeably to the right. Bullet 3 slopes to the left. We now know that bullet 3 and shell W were fired from Sacco's Colt. But what we don't know, and what I believe to be false, is whether they were genuine exhibits or whether they were substituted for genuine exhibits sometime between the crime and the trial. When we found the grand jury minutes, we found rather astonishing further corroboration that I never dreamed would be there. This was the testimony of the autopsy surgeon, Dr. George Burgess McGrath, to the grand jury. Katzman asked him, have you an opinion as to whether the 4 bullets from Baradelli's body were fired from the same weapon? And McGrath replied it was his opinion that indeed they had. Based on the eyewitness testimony, it seemed that one bandit had fired all the shots, and that in particular, one bandit had stood over Baradelli and fired several shots